were 43 people standing outside the Meridian Hotel that morning, and not one of them said a word. Nadia Osei saw everything. She was 11 years old, small for her age, wearing a yellow rain jacket 2 sizes too big, and carrying a cardboard box of homemade pralines her grandmother had wrapped in wax paper before sunrise. She had been standing on that corner since 6:15. The pralines were her grandmother's recipe. Pecans, brown sugar, a pinch of salt, and they sold for $2 apiece, which meant on a good day Nadia brought home maybe $18. On a bad day, she brought home the box and a headache. That morning was supposed to be a good day. The Meridian was hosting some kind of conference. Men in suits, women with lanyards, town cars idling at the curb. Nadia had learned early that conference crowds bought more. They felt generous when they were away from home. They tipped with 5s when they meant to tip with 1s. She had sold 9 pralines by 8 o'clock. Then the black SUV pulled up. It was the kind of vehicle that made people step back without knowing why. Dark tinted windows, chrome trim, a driver who wore actual white gloves. The man who stepped out was named Conrad Ashby. She would learn that later. At the time, she only knew what her eyes told her. Tall, gray at the temples, a suit that fit the way suits fit in movies. He had the walk of someone who had never once been told no. He almost walked right past her. Almost. His elbow caught the corner of her box. Just barely. The lightest graze. But it was enough. 3 pralines slid off the top and hit the sidewalk. The wax paper unfolded. One of them cracked straight down the middle. Nadia bent to pick them up. She heard the laughter before she saw where it came from. Ashby had stopped walking. He was looking down at her the way people look at something they stepped over on the street. Not with cruelty exactly, just with the complete absence of concern that is somehow worse. "You're blocking the entrance," he said. Nadia stood up. She was still holding the cracked praline. "I'm sorry, sir, you bumped my box." The laughter again, not from Ashby, but from the 2 men behind him. Assistants, she assumed. Men whose job was to agree. "The entrance," Ashby said again, as if she hadn't spoken. As if repeating himself was a courtesy he extended to children who did not immediately move. "I'll move in a second." She was trying to get the wax paper back around the broken praline. Her hands were not cooperating. "I just need to fix." "I don't have a second." He looked at one of the men behind him and said something low that Nadia didn't catch. But the man smiled, and that smile was the kind that made your stomach go cold. Nadia looked up at him. She was aware of the 43 people on that sidewalk. She was aware that none of them were moving. She said only one word. She said it quietly. She said it the way her mother used to say things when she meant them most, without heat, without pleading, just the word itself, clean and direct. She said, "Liar." Conrad Ashby stopped smiling. "Here's what you need to understand about that word. Coming from an 11-year-old girl on a sidewalk in downtown Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't an accusation about the pralines. It wasn't about the box or the entrance or the 30 seconds he claimed not to have. Nadia Osei said that word because she recognized him. She had seen his face before, in a photograph her mother kept folded inside a Bible on the nightstand, in a newspaper clipping her grandmother had saved for reasons she had never fully explained, and the dream she sometimes had where her mother was still alive and asking her to remember something important. Nadia recognized Conrad Ashby because Conrad Ashby had testified 3 years earlier that the construction site, where her mother worked as a safety inspector, had passed every required check. He had signed his name to that testimony. He had looked at a camera and said the words clearly. 6 weeks after that testimony, a scaffolding collapse on the 14th floor of the Ashby Finance Meridian Tower killed 2 workers. One of them was Nadia Osei, Nadia's mother. She had been 31 years old. Now you're probably thinking, what could an 11-year-old do with that? What could a girl with a box of pralines and a yellow rain jacket do against a man with lawyers on retainer and a hotel named after his company? The answer, it turned out, was more than anyone expected. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Nadia's grandmother was named Vera. She was 67 years old, moved with a cane on cold mornings, and had a memory that worked like a filing cabinet. Nothing ever truly lost, just waiting to be located. She had been a claims investigator for an insurance company for 22 years before retirement, which meant she had spent 2 decades being professionally suspicious of things people told her. When Renata died, Vera did not cry at the funeral. She cried later, alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, which Nadia knew because she heard it through the wall. But at the funeral, she sat very still with her hands folded and her eyes moving around the room, and afterward she went home and pulled out a legal pad. She wrote down everything that didn't make sense. The inspection records that had been filed 3 days before the collapse, not 3 weeks, which was the standard interval, but 3 days. The certification signature that matched Ashby's company's internal auditor, not an independent inspector. The settlement offer made to the families within 48 hours, unusually fast, Vera noted, for a company that wasn't worried about liability. The non-disclosure agreement attached to that offer, which Renata's co-worker's family had signed. Vera had not signed it. She kept the legal pad in a shoebox under her bed. Nadia didn't know about the legal pad for a long time. She was 8 when her mother died, and then 9, and then 10, and her grandmother sold the Pralines on weekends and paid the bills on time and made sure Nadia got on the school bus with clean clothes and food in her bag. And Nadia understood, without being told, that there were things Vera was carrying that she wasn't ready to put down yet. The Pralines were their rhythm. Early morning, good corner, the right crowd. Come home by noon. Count what they'd made. Figure out what the week looked like. Nadia was good at math. She was good at reading faces, too. She'd learned that early, at the corner, the way you learn to read weather. Who would stop? Who wouldn't? Who wanted to pretend they weren't going to stop, but would if she made eye contact at the right moment? She was also very good at remembering things she was not supposed to have noticed. So when Conrad Ashby's face appeared above her on that sidewalk, when his elbow caught her box and his assistants laughed and he told her to move, something clicked into place behind her sternum, cold and precise, like a key turning in a lock. Liar. She said it without thinking. Or rather, she said it thinking everything at once. The photograph, the newspaper, the Bible on the nightstand, her grandmother's legal pad that she had found and read once, at midnight when Vera was asleep. Ashby heard her. He heard her because there was a pause in the traffic, and the crowd and the ambient noise of a morning in downtown Columbus. And in that pause, the word was perfectly audible. The man with the white gloves heard it. The 2 assistants heard it. A woman with a conference lanyard standing near the door heard it and looked up from her phone. Ashby looked at Nadia for 3 full seconds. Then he walked inside. That afternoon, Nadia sat at the kitchen table with her homework, and her grandmother sat across from her with the crossword, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Nadia said, "I saw him today." Vera put down her pen. "Who?" Nadia told her. Vera was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone's dog was barking at something specific and relentless. "Where?" Vera said. "The Meridian. He was going in for a conference." Another silence. Then Vera said, "What did you do?" "Nothing." A pause. "I said 1 word." Vera looked at her. "What word?" Nadia told her. Her grandmother sat back in her chair. For a moment she looked very tired, and then she looked something else. Something Nadia had not seen on her face before, or maybe had seen and not known the name of until now. Dara went to the bedroom. She came back with a shoebox. She set it on the table between them. "I need you to know," Vera said, "that your mother knew something was wrong with those inspections. She wrote it down. She filed a formal concern with her supervisor 8 days before it happened." She paused. "That report was never entered into the official record." Nadia looked at the shoebox. "Because someone removed it? Because someone never filed it." Vera opened the box and took out the legal pad. "I've had this for 3 years. I didn't know what to do with it. I'm 67. I have a cane and a granddaughter and a praline business." She looked at Nadia. "But I also know what a fraudulent inspection record looks like, and I have everything your mother wrote down before she died." There was a woman named Joelle Marsh who wrote for the Columbus Dispatch. She had covered city development for 8 years, which meant she had covered Conrad Ashby for 8 years, which meant she had a complicated relationship with his press office that she described to colleagues as professionally hostile. She had tried twice to investigate the Meridian Tower collapse. Both times, the story had been killed. Once by an editor she later learned had connections to Ashby's foundation. Once because the surviving families had signed NDAs and gone quiet. She had kept her notes. She was sitting in a coffee shop on Fifth Avenue when a girl in a yellow rain jacket came through the door. Nadia had found her through the newspaper's website, then called the office number listed in her byline and left a message that said only, "I have documents about the Meridian Tower collapse and I want to talk to someone who's been trying to find what was buried." The receptionist had told her Miss Marsh was unavailable. Joelle Marsh had called back within the hour. They sat across from each other now, Nadia with a hot chocolate she hadn't touched, and Joelle with a recorder she hadn't turned on yet. She was waiting, watching, still calibrating whether this was real. "How old are you?" Joel asked. 11. "And the woman who died, she was your mother?" "Yes." "And the documents your grandmother has?" "She has my mother's handwritten inspection logs from the month before the collapse, which are different from the records that were filed under my mother's name. She has a copy of the internal certification that was used instead of an independent inspection. She has the letter my mother sent to her supervisor. And she has the letter the supervisor sent back, which was sent 3 days before the collapse and which says," Nadia paused and recited it from memory, because she had read it 6 times, "that the concern has been noted and forwarded for review." Forward to whom? There's no forwarding address, just that it was forwarded. Nadia finally picked up the hot chocolate. "My grandmother says that's not how those letters are supposed to be written. There's supposed to be a chain of custody, an office name, a case number. There isn't one." Joelle was quiet for a moment. Then she turned on the recorder. "Tell me," she said, "about the morning your mother went to work." Here's the thing about grief that people don't tell you. It doesn't stay where you put it. You can build a whole life around the shape of it. Routines and pralines and school buses and clean clothes, and it will still surface at the strangest moments. Standing in a coffee shop explaining your mother's death to a journalist. Looking at a shoebox on a kitchen table. Saying one word on a sidewalk to a man who believed he was unreachable. Nadia was not doing this because she had a plan. She was doing it because her mother had written things down. Because Vera had kept them. Because somewhere in the inheritance of this, the careful documentation, the professional suspicion, the refusal to let something false become permanent, there was a thread she could follow. She followed it. Joel Marsh spent 11 days verifying what Vera had given her. She found a structural engineer who had done contract work for Ashby's company in 2019 and who had refused, at the time, to sign off on the 14th-floor scaffolding. He had been told the issue had been resolved. He had not been informed of the collapse until after the settlement had been reached. She found the original inspection schedule, buried in a public records request, which showed that the certification used for the Meridian Tower had been issued by an auditor who was, at the time, employed part-time by Ashby's own development company. She found a second family, not one who had signed an NDA, but one where the surviving spouse had been advised by an attorney not to settle and had waited. They had been waiting for 3 years. She also found that Conrad Ashby was, at that exact moment, 2 weeks away from groundbreaking on a new project, a mixed-use development in the Franklinton neighborhood, publicly financed, requiring city council approval that had already been tentatively granted. The story ran on a Tuesday. It was not a small story. It was the kind of story that has 3 sections and a sidebar. It named the internal auditor. It named the supervisor who had sent the non-forwarding letter. It printed, with permission, the handwritten logs Nadia Osei had kept, her mother's handwriting, neat and precise, dates and readings in one line near the end, that Joelle had put in the second paragraph of her article. Scaffolding on 14, showing stress marks inconsistent with load-bearing spec. Flagged for review, awaiting response. The response had never come. Ashby's legal team issued a statement within hours, then a second one, then a third one that contradicted the first. The city council postponed the Franklin vote. The structural engineer gave a recorded interview. By Thursday, the state attorney general had announced a preliminary inquiry. Vera saw the notification on her phone at 6 in the morning. She was in the kitchen making coffee. She stood there for a very long time reading the article, and then she set the phone down and leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. When Nadia came downstairs, Vera was still standing there. "Is it okay?" Nadia asked. Vera opened her eyes. She looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, at the yellow rain jacket hung by the door, at the praline tins on the counter, at this child who had been carrying something without Vera fully understanding how much. "Your mother would be very proud," Vera said. That was all she said. Sometimes that's all there is to say. Conrad Ashby did not lose everything in a single morning. That's how it works in stories. In reality, things unravel at the speed of institutions, which is slower and in some ways worse because you have to watch it happen in increments. His legal team filed a motion to challenge the admissibility of the private documents. The motion was denied. The internal auditor cooperated with the inquiry in exchange for reduced exposure. The Franklinton project was suspended indefinitely, pending review of all prior Ashby finance developments. 3 other city projects were flagged. 2 other collapsed appeals from workers' families who had accepted settlements but had been quietly monitoring were reopened. It took 14 months. At the end of those 14 months, Conrad Ashby signed a consent decree, paid a fine that his attorneys described as significant and that everyone else described as not enough, and was barred from bidding on publicly financed projects in the state for a period of 7 years. It was not everything. Nadia knew that. Vera knew that. Joelle Marsh knew that. But here is what also happened in those 14 months. A new state inspector certification requirement was written into law, one requiring independent third-party review with documented chain of custody. It was called the Osei Protocol in committee. The name didn't make it into the final legislation, but the people who wrote it knew where it came from. The supervisor who had sent the letter was investigated and ultimately retired early. The records were corrected. Nadia Osei's original inspection report, the one that had never been entered, the one that had flagged the 14th floor, was added to the official record. Her name was in the official record now. Nadia was 13 when the consent decree was signed. She was standing in the courthouse hallway with Vera and Joelle, waiting for nothing in particular. Just waiting the way you wait after something long and difficult reaches its end. A man in a suit she didn't recognize walked past them and then stopped and turned and said to Vera, "Mrs. Osei." Vera Osei, yes. He was one of the attorneys from the opposing side. He had the particular look of a man who has just revised his understanding of something. "Your daughter," he said, "the logs she kept. They were very thorough." Vera looked at him. "Yes," she said. "She was." He nodded, uncertain what else to say, and walked on. Nadia watched him go. Then she looked at her grandmother, and her grandmother was looking back at her, and outside the courthouse windows the morning was doing. What mornings do in Ohio in late October, gray and specific with the particular light that comes just before the clouds decide. Vera reached over and took Nadia's hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "There's something I want you to sit with before you go." On that sidewalk outside the Meridian Hotel, Nadia Osei was 11 years old and holding a broken praline and standing in front of a man who had never once been told no. And she said one word, not because she had a plan, not because she knew how it would go, because her mother had written things down and her grandmother had kept them, and somewhere in the accumulation of that care, the legal pad, the shoebox, the careful handwriting in a notebook, there was a truth that had been waiting to be recognized. Conrad Ashby heard the word and walked inside. But he heard it. And some things, once heard, don't go back to silence. I keep thinking about that broken praline on the sidewalk. Such a small thing, a man's elbow, a cardboard box, 3 pieces of candy hitting concrete. And in the middle of all that, a girl standing up straight, looking at someone twice her height and 400 times her wealth, and saying the one word she knew to be true. What Nadia did that morning wasn't luck, and it wasn't magic. It was the result of something that had been building for 3 years in a shoebox, under a bed, in her grandmother's handwriting, in her mother's inspection logs, in the kind of meticulous, unglamorous care that most people never see, and history rarely credits. Vera kept the records because she believed truth has weight. Renata wrote things down because she believed her own observations mattered. And Nadia absorbed both of those beliefs without anyone sitting her down and making a lesson out of them. She just watched. She remembered. She showed up. That's the part I want to sit with. Not the headline. Not "Millionaire loses development contract" or "State opens investigation." The part before all of that. The part where an 11-year-old girl chose honesty over silence in a moment when silence would have been so much easier and so much safer. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have a platform. She had a box of pralines and one word, and the moral clarity that comes from having been raised by people who did not lie to themselves about what they saw. As a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on tests. It showed up in how Nadia read the room on that sidewalk, how she found Joel Marsh's byline, how she walked into that coffee shop and laid out her grandmother's evidence, like someone who had rehearsed it, not with flashcards but with grief. She had spent 3 years learning the shape of what happened to her mother. That kind of knowledge is hard-earned, and it doesn't leave you. And then there's what I'd call the third thing, the staying power, the willingness to keep going when nothing is guaranteed. 14 months is a long time to wait for a consent decree that still doesn't feel like enough. Nadia was 11 when she said the word and 13 when the case closed. She spent 2 years watching institutions move at the speed of institutions, which is to say slowly and without drama. She could have stopped. She had every reason to stop. She didn't. I think about what Vera said at the end. Not a speech, not a summation, just, "Your mother would be very proud." 6 words. And somehow that was the whole thing. The whole argument for why it mattered, why it was worth the 14 months and the legal pads and the shoebox and the cold morning outside a hotel where a man in a good suit had told a girl to move. Nadia Osei wrote things down because she thought it mattered. She was right. It just took 3 years and a daughter with a good memory and a grandmother who never threw anything away. Some things once written down don't stay buried.